Welcome back. This is the first video for Chapter 3, and the first part of the intermediate macroeconomics textbook that we're using is designed to build a model of the whole economy and how it behaves in the short run. And we're going to do this by, in Chapter 3, first looking at the goods market, and then in Chapter 4, looking at the financial markets. And in Chapter 3, the idea is that we create an equilibrium where everything that we buy, everything that we demand as in an economy is equal to everything that we produce in the economy. Now, there are a couple caveats, one minor, one major, that we have to talk about. First is that the timing of things. We don't always produce exactly what we consume in the year, right? We might consume things later. We might consume things that had been produced earlier. That's a minor issue. The major issue is, obviously, for a national economy, we export and import goods and services. And so for the United States, that's about 14 to 15%, but for a smaller country, it could be 50, 60, 70, even 80% of GDP, meaning that a lot of what you produce, you sell in other countries, and a lot of what you consume is produced in other countries. So in Chapter 3, we'll introduce exports and imports, but then we'll wave it away and pretend they don't exist. And then we'll add it back later in the textbook. So this model is going to be fairly simple, but we'll make it a little bit more complicated as we go ahead. So as I said, we're going to focus here on the goods market, right? And so this is goods and services, we should say, right? Everything that we demand and that we produce. And so we're going to think about, all right, well, how do changes in demand lead to changes in production in the short run? And the key difference between, say, the short run and the medium run is that we don't expect inflation to be a big issue in the short run, but it could be, price changes could be a big issue in the medium run. And the whole idea goes back to what we talked about in Chapter 2, that GDP, gross domestic product, is theoretically equal to GDI, gross domestic income. So that when firms produce things, they need workers to produce them. They have to pay those workers, and so an increase in production also equals an increase in income. So we're going to think about three main pieces of GDP. So consumption. So consumption is the largest piece of GDP in the United States, although that's not always true in every country. Investment, which is going to be non-residential investment, which is business investment, buying the things that they need to produce goods and services. So that could be everything from factories to machines to trucks to computers. And then residential investment, which is building new houses, which is a larger issue in the United States than some other countries. And then we have government spending, and we kind of lump government spending together, even though government spending can either be consumption or investment. Sometimes you'll see the national accounts actually break that out into consumption government spending and investment government spending. But we're going to talk about government spending in total by the federal, state, and local governments in the United States. It does not include government transfers. So a government transfer is where you tax one group of people and send it to another group of people. So Social Security is probably the most important example of that, but also unemployment insurance, anything that is a tax on one group that gets sent to another group because it doesn't buy any goods, right? Those people are going to spend that money on buying goods. That's when we're going to count it in GDP. So we have C plus I plus G. Now, later in the textbook, we're also going to add in exports and subtract imports, right? We're going to add exports because we produce them, we sell them somewhere else. We're going to subtract imports because we buy them, but somebody else has produced them. So here, exports and imports, we're going to call exports X and imports IM. And then net exports, or the trade balance, is just going to be X minus IM, right? And a lot of attention often gets paid to the trade balance. If exports are larger than imports, like they are in countries like China and Germany, you have a trade surplus. If imports are larger than exports, like they are in countries like the United States, then you have a trade deficit. And then finally, that last little piece that we talked about, the inventory investment, that's just the difference between when things get produced and when they get sold. And so in the United States, if you think about a year, most of what we produce we will sell that year, but there will be some left over, and then obviously we'll have bought some things that were produced in a previous year. Used to be a big focus of understanding recessions. The idea would be that businesses would be building up inventory and then consumers wouldn't be buying them because of whatever drop in demand, but that's a little bit less of a focus in current models. So here's just a look at GDP in the United States in 2014, just to get an idea of the magnitude, right? You can see consumption is about 2/3 of GDP. Investment is about 16%, with non-residential investment being about 13% and residential investment being about 3%. That's probably a little bit lower than it usually is. We're still recovering from the housing bubble in 2014. And then net exports. So you can see exports are about 13.5%, imports 16.6%, but we subtract that. And so net exports in the United States were minus 3.1%. And we'll talk about exports in general and sort of international trade in later chapters in this course. And then you can see inventory investment was only about 0.4%. So we produced a little bit more than we bought in 2014. So here's our basic model, right, for the demand for goods. Z is our demand, is equal to consumption spending, C, investment spending, I, government spending, G, exports, right, that's the demand from other countries in the world, minus imports, because we don't produce those. But we do buy them, right? So the imports are going to be in C and I and G, and so that's why we have to subtract them out, because we didn't produce them. Now, we are going to make the simplifying assumption in this chapter that we're in a closed economy. So exports and imports are both equal to 0, and we can just say that demand is equal to C plus I plus G. As I said, we will relax that assumption later, but it allows us to do a little bit more simplified model and not worry about things like exchange rates and foreign interest rates. So we're going to start by modeling consumption, right? That's our main picture, and we're going to make the assumption that consumption increases when disposable income increases. So disposable income is just income minus taxes plus transfers. So you get your income from your job, you have to pay the taxes, and if you get any transfers like Social Security or unemployment benefits, that's going to increase your disposable income. And so the idea with this plus sign here in equation 3.1 is that consumption goes up when disposable income goes up, right? And that's the only assumption that we're making at the moment, although as we'll see when we do an actual mathematical example, we'll assume that it's linear, just to make the math easier. So this is the kind of thing that we're doing right now. We're talking about total consumption in the economy and total disposable income. There could be some people who don't consume more when their income goes up, they just save more. But for the whole economy, I think it's a reasonable assumption that when disposable income goes up, consumption goes up. Now, so as I said, putting a mathematical framework on this assumption, we're going to assume a linear relationship. It doesn't have to be a linear relationship, right? This is just going to make our life easier in terms of graphing it, in terms of solving for the equilibrium, which we will do. So we're going to say, all right, consumption is equal to C0. That's some amount of consumption that doesn't depend on income, right? You got to eat no matter what your income is, plus some fraction of your disposable income, right? You're not going to spend everything of your disposable income. Some of it you're going to save. Now, think of this as sort of the average, what we call the propensity to consume throughout the economy. It's going to vary a lot by person, right? Someone who doesn't have a lot of money, C1 is going to be very close to 1 or 100%, right? They're going to spend basically all of their income because they need to in order to survive. Whereas someone who's super rich might have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5 or even lower because they get some extra income and they don't need to consume it. They've already consumed enough and they're just going to save it. So C1 is the propensity to consume. C0 is what you need to consume even if your disposable income is 0. So we're going to graph this, right? We've got disposable income, that's our independent variable on the horizontal axis, and consumption, that's our dependent variable on the vertical axis. We've got C0, that's our intercept, and then our slope is equal to C1. Now the key thing about this slope of C1 is that it has to be less than 1, right? You can't spend more than your income. And so that's going to be really important when we look to find our equilibrium. So this is just a straight line with a slope less than 1, C equals C0 plus C1 times YD. Now what is YD? What is disposable income? Well, we're just going to say it is income Y minus taxes. Now Y is important, right? Because we said Y in the last chapter was GDP. And as we said, GDP should equal GDI, gross domestic income. And so that Y is going to be really important when we start looking at our equilibrium condition. So we've got disposable income YD is just defined as total income Y minus taxes. And we can say this is taxes minus government transfers, right? Because we can just net that out. If you pay $500 in taxes and you get $400 in government transfers, then your net tax is just $100. So now we can replace that in our consumption function and get that consumption is equal to C0 plus C1 times Y minus T. And so that's going to be really important in terms of finding our equilibrium. Now, with every model, with every economic model, every mathematical model, you're going to have two different types of variables. You're going to have endogenous variables, which are determined within the model, and you're going to have exogenous variables, variables that are determined outside the model. So we've actually already seen two parameters, I don't know if we would call them exogenous variables, but C0 and C1 that are going to be very important. We're also going to assume, just for Chapter 3, that investment is fixed. We're just going to take it as given. And that's just to build up a simple model here in Chapter 3. We're going to relax this assumption once we introduce interest rates, right? Because interest rates are going to be very important for how much people invest, whether that's business investment or residential investment. So when we put a bar on a variable, that means it's exogenous. It's taken as given. It's just a fixed number. So when we think about policy, right, we're going to think about two major policies in macroeconomics. Monetary policy, which depends on interest rates and the money supply, and fiscal policy, which depends on taxes and government spending. So right now we're going to assume that government spending and taxes are exogenous, right? Governments don't have to behave the same way that consumers and businesses do. They have the ability to borrow, especially the federal government. But it is interesting to figure out what those variables are, right? Because, for instance, in the United States, government spending is somewhere around 20%. In other countries, it's 40%, especially because a lot of the, more, I should say, of medical spending happens at the government level in other countries that it doesn't happen in the United States. So we're going to treat G and T as exogenous, but just keep in mind that it's very interesting to think about those levels and whether or not that affects the equilibrium significantly. All right, so what do we have for our equilibrium in the goods market? Well, we assume that imports and exports are zero, so we have total demand is equal to C plus I plus G. And all we're going to do then is substitute in our equation for C, so we have C0 plus C1 times Y minus T, and our fixed investment. And then we have government, which is also exogenous as well. Now the equilibrium condition says that everything that we buy, our Z, our demand, has to be equal to everything that we produce, our Y. Now that's important because look, we've already got a Y in that equation. That's going to help us solve for our equilibrium. And so our equilibrium condition in the goods market says that everything we produce, Y, has to be equal to everything that we demand, Z. Now obviously we're going to make this picture more complicated later on when we introduce endogenous investment spending, when we introduce more endogenous exports and imports, and so we'll talk about that, but for now we have a fairly simple model.